Okay, Megan, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Good morning. Well, morning for me.
Yeah, morning for me too. Not too much in the difference. So you're mostly teaching like history for the most part, junior high grades, any like high school experience as well, or just mostly kind of within that like 6 to 8 realm?
I taught a year of high school, and so there was I taught a couple periods of U.S. history and a couple periods of world history, and I loved
Okay.
it. That was my
Yeah.
first year, and I wanted to get back to high school, and it just never worked out. There were just never high school job openings, and it was always
Mhm.
middle school. So that's where I've been for the last 12 years. But
Okay. Wow. All right.
It's it's been good. I always kind of pictured myself teaching high school, but then now that I'm
Mhm.
in middle school, I'm like, this might be my sweet spot. This might be where I'm
Okay,
supposed to
why
be.
your sweet spot? Because I find it's the people junior high of any teaching of any grade. It's usually like a love-hate relationship, and I mean, and hate is a strong word, but I mean that in this context of like certain age groups or areas. Why junior high for you? Why is it the sweet spot?
Well, I've taught every grade level in junior high. So currently, right now, I'm teaching all of them. So I have some classes
Mhm.
of sixth graders, some of seventh, and some of eighth. And so I get to kind of see the whole gamut. My sixth graders are really, really chatty. They really, really want to tell you everything. They have a
Mhm.
comment about everything, which is sometimes too much. But then after them, I'll have this class of eighth graders come in and they just
They're just very
they,
posh.
they don't want to say, they don't want to reply to anything. So I'm like trying to
Yeah.
pull more out of them. So you just have, it's so funny to watch like their growth from sixth to eighth because they switch my schedule every year. So a
Mhm.
few of my kids, I had them in sixth and seventh and eighth. So I've
Okay. Yeah.
seen them grow and change so much from sixth to eighth
Mhm.
grade. And so it's just kind of funny to watch their little personalities and how much they change from
Yeah.
the beginning of the year to the end. So they're pretty fun for the most part.
All right, I like that. And like honestly, I didn't mind junior high either. I just found it was more like generally exhausting during the day, but I'm mostly in grade 11 and 12 now, some grade 10 stuff as well. But we just do like a blanket social studies course in Alberta.
Oh, okay.
And so there is no history of any kind in terms of a specific lane, which is kind of strange. Yeah. I figured I was kind of surprised by it. We just have grade 10, 11, 12, and it's globalization, nationalism, ideology for the three grade levels. So it's pretty,
Hmm.
I would say, confined or limiting in a certain sense. But one of the reasons, like, you've obviously had a pretty specific route yourself teaching history for the most part over the last 12 years. Do you ever kind of get the backlash of like history doesn't matter, social studies is a stupid course from your students and kind of that remark? I typically do. And I guess what I'm asking is like, how do you kind of relay what the importance of social studies is to your students and why it's worth learning about?
I feel like that's a really common,
Yeah.
maybe like stereotype, the kids are like,
Yeah.
this doesn't matter. This doesn't apply to
Yeah.
my life. But I haven't really gotten it that much.
Okay.
They do always switch my schedule, so I'm always teaching different things. But teaching eighth grade history here in California, that's US. And so they can pretty clearly see the connections, as we study the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And they love looking for like the hypocrisy and the inconsistencies in like these founding documents. And that's like very fun for them to
Okay.
get to kind of be involved in that process.
Mhm.
And then now I'm teaching ancient history, which is, arguably the least relevant to anything. It's like ancient Mesopotamia. Like,
Yeah, but
let's
honestly,
look
those
at
are my favorite courses. Like I remember, like it
yeah.
was your for your classic history major. Usually, your first year is
Hmm.
some form of like long or
Hmm.
ancient history. Long history. Listen to me. Clearly, I haven't read up on it in a while. But if you were to get that question, like why social studies is important, like how would you respond to that? Because usually, I've noticed like I'll get that from time to time, and I guess in my defense, we kind of start grade 12 of like, here's Voltaire, here's John Stuart Mill, and all these
Hmm.
kind of liberal philosophers. So it can kind of seem a bit detached. But
Hmm.
like, how would you typically respond to that? Or like, what is your kind of your go to response?
Well, usually I'm trying to kind of hook these students
Mhm,
into at least being interested in history so that when there's
mhm,
something else that they want to know about, they at least kind of have the skills to do that, because maybe not every single kid cares all that much about
Yeah.
the ancient Phoenicians or whatever, but
Yeah.
we do make it fun. They tend to be pretty interested in the battles and in like the
Mhm.
artifacts that we've found. And terracotta warriors are like my favorite thing ever that were found in
Okay.
China, and they're all completely different, and like they're just amazing. And a lot of my students are either from China or their families are from China, so it's cool to kind of look at these civilizations that like came before us, and so we're kind of studying everyone's
Mhm.
ancestors and seeing all the cool things that they
Oh,
invented.
okay.
So there's hooks, and we do, for example, like we're studying ancient China right now, so we'll do a Lunar New Year party in our class and kind of connect these ancient like traditions and see how they still
Mhm.
influence the holidays today. When we study ancient India, we do a holy festival and look at how, like Hinduism influenced this holiday and still has impacts today. And so we make it fun and we kind of bring some things around. And so now I feel like if there's more that my students want to know, they'll be able to kind of at least Google things, at least kind of check things
Yeah.
out or ask the right questions.
So what would you say then are like the skills you're trying to hone with them? Like you said, let's just say they aren't interested in this one avenue per se, but now they have the skills to kind of pursue the other avenue. So I think it's like the obvious ones, like, oh, they have the critical thinking abilities, they have like general media literacy capabilities, but how do you do you have like a process for kind of how you try to hone that skill with your students, especially at that age group?
Um, Curiosity is probably the most important
Mhm.
skill, just to kind of get them even moving in the direction where they could like ask questions. And then we just use a lot of different media. So sometimes we'll listen to podcasts about a topic, and then sometimes we'll go find a website. Sometimes we'll go to a museum website. Sometimes we'll find a YouTube video. So I try to kind of like vary all of the ways that we're getting our information and use like high quality sources so that they're able to like, oh yeah, didn't like this museum website have information? Maybe we can go there. Like that podcast had an episode and it's,
I
it's
like
sent
that.
to kids. So
Because you're kind of
hopefully.
getting them involved in like selecting the resources they choose. Like you still have the
Mhm.
obviously the outcome you're trying to get them to approach, but you're still kind of like you're getting them to hook themselves, which almost
Mhm.
seems like a good way of doing it. But
Sometimes there are even
and s-
games that, websites create, and then you're kind of like learning by default an accident. And
yeah,
they'll go
yeah, the
back to
learn
those games because they're fun even on their own time, and they'll keep playing the games and keep learning little things on accident.
yeah. Yeah, I think the learning by accident is definitely the goal. Like we always like especially in junior high, I've had some teachers tell me like they've tricked people into like, oh, should we have a cell phone policy at our school? Or like tell me why you should be allowed to have your phone in class. But then they're learning to argue and they're using
Hmm.
evidence and they're actually looking at sources. So it's kind of you're tricking them into it, which I think is definitely
Yeah.
if you can figure out how to do that, I think you'll be fine as a teacher. But I
We
guess
do structured academic controversies for that.
okay.
And so those are really, really effective in teaching kids how to like select evidence and put it together and create an argument and listen to the other side and respond to the other side.
So
Those are really
structured
fun.
academic controversy, is that like something that's online or is this like a program that you guys use or is that just like a general topic?
I'm trying to find the book where I
Okay.
where I read about it.
Mhm.
Um, Somewhere over here. I have a book.
Yeah.
And I'll like email it to you if I
Yeah.
remember, and you can put it in the show
Sure. Yeah.
notes. But there was research done, I think I want to say out of like Wisconsin, and they studied like the most effective ways for students to learn history and kind of like different perspective taking. And so a structured academic controversy was the way that they found was the best way to do that. And so it just consists of giving students which side they're going to argue. So no one really knows what you think. It doesn't really matter what you think.
Yeah.
It's almost like you're a lawyer. Like if you're the defense attorney, you just defend them, whether you think they're guilty
Yeah.
or not. And if you're a prosecutor, you just say they're guilty. So they are given their side, and I always have them work in pairs. And then there's question that they are arguing. And then a good website is procon.org, and it has a bunch of different topics, and the research is already pulled like from credible sources. Because to also do the research is what would make things take way too long and be way too just like convoluted of a
Okay.
process.
Yeah. All
But
right.
the research is already there. So they can just pull the evidence that they thought was most convincing, and then they make their arguments. Each person has to talk for like 1 minute, and they have to listen to the other side. They're not allowed to speak while the other side is speaking. And then they can respond later. And then they kind of have their final arguments. And then in the end, they can like say what they really think. Like, were you convinced by this? Did you really believe what you were saying? And
Yeah,
so
because I
and
guess
it
it's
forces them to hear both sides.
and it's getting them to argue like even things that they don't agree with. Because like I do something similar with
Mm-hmm.
my grade 12s because you're talking about like left wing, right wing spectrum stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I have found the research process takes way too long. And like
Yeah.
I'm trying to get them, I guess like the final trick that I use, and maybe this was like maybe a little bit too long for junior high, would be they don't know what side they're arguing till the day of. So they
Oh,
have
you
to
have to
equally
prepare.
prepare both
Ah,
sides. So that way, like,
a little hard.
well, whether or not you even personally agree or disagree, you kind of
Yeah.
have both sides. Like you're kind of not the straw man, but the strong. Is it? There's another. What's the word for straw man? But it's like a good argument. Steel man. Yeah,
Oh,
you're
the
like
steel
steel.
man.
You're
Mhm.
steel manning the argument like without even realizing, which I think is
Mhm.
definitely a valuable skill. And so
Yeah.
how have you had any like problems kind of getting into controversial issues in your classroom? Like is there a way that you kind of prepare your class for that or
Well, usually when we do these, I purposely choose pretty like mild topics. So one of them is like, should kids have homework? And so,
okay.
I mean, no
Ease them
one's going to
in.
get like their feelings hurt over that, probably. And one of them is like, should we put more resources into space exploration or sea exploration? And so they're not usually very like personal topics for the most part.
Mhm.
But if we can practice having those conversations about topics that are, a little bit more mild, then when it does come to something that's more serious or more personal to someone, they've at least had a little bit of practice in like how to have those conversations. And then that makes things go a little bit better.
Yeah, because I'll be honest, I kind of just dip my toes right into it, and I say they can pretty
Mhm.
much go wherever. But I usually preface it with like a few days of. Have you ever heard of like terror management theory
No.
before?
Terror
So,
management theory?
yeah, it's like TMT. I think his name was Ernest Becker. But anyway, I had a professor when I was in university for like teaching social studies specifically. And I guess I can also link this later on. But a lot of the work has been done by Catherine von Kessel, who I'm going to have on here pretty soon eventually. Um, but it pretty much talks about like why we do have like an embedded emotional reaction to things like it's like why we get triggered and like why we have kind of developed a response to behave that way. And it all, I guess my best interpretation of it so far is that you've kind of lived your life up to a certain point surviving knowing this information, so when someone challenges that, like they're literally actually threatening like what has gotten you to this point, right? It's kind of like a weird how like a weird fear of death kind of ties into why you do emotionally respond that way. Anyway, that's probably I'm not gonna try to speak more on that because I'm definitely not an expert on it, but
To listen to
I
the
think that
next
stuff,
episode.
yeah, like I think that stuff's super fascinating. And I think just like why do we even get nervous for controversy? I guess when we kind of
Mhm.
know it's there, I think is an interesting way to go about it.
Certain things I don't allow as topics for controversy. Like if we are debating like somebody's right to exist or someone like
yes, yeah,
um, I saw a debate that was like still being promoted the other day by someone with like a PhD. Um, like, should we have interned Japanese Americans during World War II? Like, that's a closed question. We've
yeah,
already answered that. We
yeah,
made reparations for that. That's over.
yeah,
And no, the answer is no.
yeah.
And I have students whose grandparents were the people who were interned. So we're not going to argue.
Yeah.
We're not going to do like a thought experiment about whether or not my grandparents should have been ripped from their homes and had everything taken
Yeah.
from them
It's not
and were in
a
prison. We're not
valuable
doing
plan.
that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I guess maybe I should have. I'm not going to say that that's what I bring up in my class, but it's more so like in grade 12, especially with liberalism, like individual rights and freedoms, it'll say like if they want to talk about abortion, for example, they're more than welcome to get involved in that discussion. But when it comes to like literally your right to exist as a human in peace and prosperity, that's not something that we put up for debate.
And history teachers, I think for a long time did do that, because I think in our like college classes and like pedagogy classes, I think they really purport that same stereotype that like kids aren't going to care about history. No one likes history. You have to do something shocking to make kids
Yeah.
excited about it. And so then sometimes the tactic is like, have these debates that are going to get kids really emotionally invested.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't really agree. I think that there's plenty of like primary source documents that are actually really exciting if you're a good teacher and you know
Yep.
how to like make the documents come alive, look at artifacts. You don't have to use shock value all the time or like reenactments. You do not need to reenact like a slave market in order to get kids to care about this topic. Like I just have
Has
seen
this happened?
this go, oh my gosh. American schools, oh my goodness, have just done like untold damage through history classes under the guise of like, let's get kids involved in this
Pedagogy.
and make them remember it. Like, no, don't do that.
Yeah, that is I can't say that's ever come up in my ideas of like how to make things more, but I get the shock value, I think, is extremely overrepresented, I would say, in the teaching of it, because I guess I feel like I almost feel like I'm a worse teacher when I'm not providing the shock value all the time. But I loved what you said about just making the documents come alive. Like actually get into like the nitty gritty text of it and say, this is what this means, this is how it was perceived, and kind of getting them to unpack that is actually an enjoyable process once you've kind of learned about it and get into it. Which I mean,
It's
that's
the
my
shocking stories.
yeah, I know. Like
No.
there's too much interesting stuff. Like I always use a story. I think I was in like a Presidents of War book. I think Michael Beschloss. I could be wrong on his last name, but he told a story about FDR and Winston Churchill during World War II. Churchill was visiting Roosevelt, and they were kind of going through their meetings. I think it was right before the Lend-Lease aid agreement, and Roosevelt walks in on Churchill naked. And, like he walks into his room, and he's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir. Like I didn't mean to barge in on you." He's like, "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." I thought that was just such a classic line. But
on Churchill's side. He had that plan.
Probably. Yeah. He's like, I'm just gonna wait for Frank to walk down. But yeah. And so some of the work that I've seen you've been doing is emphasizing the importance of Caribbean history to kind of supplement, or not necessarily to supplement, but to kind of scaffold with the American history. What's kind of been your exploration into that? Or what inspired that?
Yeah, I mean, this is like the thing that I could talk about forever.
Let's
That
go.
I've never seen in an American classroom, and something I didn't know about. But when I was doing my master's degree in history, during that same time, we were at a family function at my father-in-law's house, and his wife had mentioned that, like, oh yeah, when he was living in the Virgin Islands, I knew he was from the Virgin Islands, but she said there is like a statue there of his grandfather, and he's like the Martin Luther King Jr. of the Virgin Islands. And I was like, what? I never heard of this guy. So I looked him up, and I was like, well, I have access to all these, different sources and kind of collections of documents and stuff. So I'll kind of dedicate one of my research projects to this guy named Rothschild Francis. And then once I started looking him up, I was just hooked. I was like, I need to know the whole story. So the cool thing about him was that he started a newspaper in like the 1920s in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, just after the United States purchased the islands from Denmark, and they purchased the islands 1 week before they entered World War One. So it was a naval base. They just wanted to like park their ships there, and they didn't want Germany to buy it. So they didn't give the people there any rights. So there's another really interesting book. I have it right here. This one, How to Hide an Empire. And this one is about all these different territories that the United States purchased, while we still always say that we're like not an empire and like we don't have colonies, we don't do that kind of stuff, but we have so many.
It's almost even more aggressive that they just outright bought them.
Yeah.
Like, rather than just like, that's a very sneaky way of saying we're not colonized. Yeah. But anyway, sorry, continue.
Yeah. And not colonized in the same way that we did as we like moved west, like westward expansion, and a bunch of white people would move in and kind of eradicate the native populations. In these territories, they just like ignored the people entirely and didn't give them any rights. So Rothschild Francis was really interesting because he knew US history really, really well. He knew the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And so he started this newspaper to tell like his fellow Virgin Islanders, like, if you're part of America, that means you have freedom of speech, you have freedom of press, you have the right to a jury trial. We should have all these rights, and they didn't. And so he would get arrested for libel. And he's like, but I should have, freedom of the press. And they'd be like, well, you don't. And then he would go face his charges before this same naval judge every single time. He's like, well, I want a jury trial. And they're like, well, you don't get one. It's like, you're kind of proving my point. Like these are rights that we should have. And they didn't have any representative government. All their government officials were appointed by the Navy. So he just used his knowledge of US history and US government to make the case that the Constitution should follow the flag, that like if you plant your flag here, the Constitution should apply to the citizens. So he wrote legislation for Virgin Islanders' civil rights, and he presented that legislation before Congress in 1924. So it's been 100 years.
Wow.
And he's a Black man from the Virgin Islands with his Caribbean accent, and traveled to Washington, D.C. and presented this really strong case in front of Congress that his people should have the rights of the Constitution, change the way that civil rights operated in the Virgin Islands, and was eventually, though, continued to be arrested and fined, and he eventually had to leave the island, probably fearing for his life, and he never came back. So he left in like the 1930s and moved to New York. But the writings are still there. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters, and he was friends with W.E.B. Du Bois and wrote back and forth with him and reached out to all of these other Black leaders kind of during like the Harlem Renaissance era. And so he was just amazing. And so I feel like his documents, his writings are really interesting to study. And they illuminate a lot about like, okay, he's using this text. He's using the Declaration of Independence to make an argument about his people. So like that can teach us more about the Declaration of Independence, or he's using the Constitution and quoting this to make his arguments. So let's study his arguments and look at how does this apply, not just in 1770s, but how does this apply later on as the United States expands? And then additionally, when students do start learning about like the Harlem Renaissance era and the politics of that, it was almost all Caribbean immigrants who fought for all of these kind of political rights, like Marcus Garvey, Claude McKay. All of these guys are all from the Caribbean because the culture is so different there. And then they move to the United States where they're treated like crap, and they're like, what is this? No. Like, we're not gonna stand for this. So just like the impact of Caribbeans to American politics and like Black culture is really, really important too. And so I've just never seen that taught in any American history book. And so I would like to see that included more.
Yeah. How do your students kind of respond to this? Because even I'm kind of flabbergasted a little bit right now. Because, like, how do your students typically respond?
Well, So this is another reason why I kind of like teaching high school, because I like the content. Like I would take a job teaching high school because this is where the content fits. So since I don't teach high school, this doesn't like weave seamlessly into our history. But I went to the Virgin Islands in November, and so I taught my like sixth grade history students. I was like, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to go give a lecture in St. Thomas, and I get to talk about this guy who I wrote my master's thesis on. There's a statue of him on the island. And so we learned about him a little bit, and they drew like a picture of him and like wrote all these facts. And so I brought their projects to the Virgin Islands and gave them to a teacher there to like show her students, like, look, kids in California are learning about, this great civil rights leader from your island. And so I kind of had to sneak it in there, but they thought he was so cool, and they made so many connections. It was so funny. Because they're reading his writing, they're reading his words, and they know I like Hamilton, the musical. And they're like, he sounds like Hamilton, like the way that he writes and the way that he talks about the government. And I was like, I know. And guess where Hamilton was born? And they're like, what? He's born in the Caribbean. He's born in the Virgin Islands too, before he came to the colonies. But they could see a lot of the through lines, even as sixth graders without much context. So it's just like so much fun to bring Caribbean.
Yeah. I love that. How was your kind of lecture received down in St. Thomas? Did you kind of like give it in front of the statue, or like what was the kind of context?
It was at like a library, like a genealogy library, but a lot of people came. I was surprised. I was like, oh wow, okay. So there are a lot of people there who are really into like local history, and so I really, really wish that as I was like writing my master's thesis that I had been able to travel there. I just didn't have the money to like do a trip, but it is very different reading about this guy and reading about the Virgin Islands and the culture and everything, and like publishing a thesis having not been there. Because then when I went there were so many more things that I learned that you just can't learn in a book. And so all of these people, there's like this rumor on the island that when he did escape from St. Thomas, that he dressed as a coal woman, because the St. Thomas was like a kind of like a gas station. It's like a coaling station. Yep. So these ships would come there, and these women would bring coal. They would bounce it on their head and walk up the plank and drop it off and go back down and bring up more. And so several people were like, oh, is that the guy who escaped like dressed as a coal woman? I was like, I don't know. I'd never heard that before. Like that wasn't in the books, but I heard that multiple times. And he had kind of an enemy in the government, another guy who he was also Black and a Virgin Islander. Oh, there he is right there, this guy. He became the first Navy bandmaster. And they were kind of on opposite ends of like how they felt about the government. And then one lady told me she was a descendant of this one. And she was like, did you know that their grandkids ended up marrying each other and having, I was like, yes, oh my gosh, that's amazing. That's hilarious. They are rolling over in their graves. So just all these things that I would never, ever have known had I not gone there. And I even had like, in my presentation, I had a couple like dates wrong. And so they were so nice. They were like so, kind about it. It was mostly like older people, kind of retired, but this is like the thing they do for fun. Oh, yeah. That'll be me too. But, they again, like, just so you know, like this was the date when we did get citizenship and got passports and stuff. And so they did fact check a couple things. I was like, oh, okay, thank you. So now moving forward, I can adjust some things. But you learn, much faster just being there and learning from people who live there and would understand like references. He painted a picture. We have it in our living room for W.E.B. Du Bois. And I didn't know like what the plant was. And all of them were like, oh, that's a century plant. Like, yeah, that's what's out there. So like a lot of questions were answered super quickly because they know. So that was like one of the most fun things I've ever gotten to do. I want to go back every year. I want to go back all the time.
That's sweet. Because that's one thing I've kind of, I feel like maybe the podcast is just where I go to vent my struggles now. But in like teaching history, social studies in this lane, I'm like overwhelmingly under traveled. as myself. Like I'm mostly been around Canada for the most part, and I always say I have the whitest travel record alive. I've been to Florida and California, both for Disney. So like it's not really the craziest. But I guess it kind of touches on your exact point of like in being a history teacher, how embedded do you need to be, do you think, in the context of the areas you're talking about in order to be like an authoritative source on those?
Yeah, well, the rough thing about being a history teacher, maybe it's slightly different in Canada, but like
Mhm.
for California, you get your history degree, and so you kind of know a little bit about a lot, right? And
Yeah.
then maybe like a little more about kind of one thing where you really
Mhm.
focused, and
Know little
then
about a lot. That's fair.
you get a job, or you start applying for jobs, and you could be teaching ancient history, you could be teaching medieval history, you could be teaching like revolutionary for America, or
Mhm.
you could be teaching, modern world. So you have to just like suddenly become an expert on whichever thing they plop you into, and then next year they might switch you to something else. And
Yep.
so I feel for history teachers because it can be tough to have to like pivot and like become an expert suddenly on
Mhm.
all these different things. Like, my husband will always ask me kind of random history questions, and I'm like, I don't know everything about everything. I can tell you a lot about the Virgin Islands. I can tell
Yeah.
you a lot about ancient history right now, but I can't like
Yeah.
pull every single history fact about like
Yeah.
medieval Russia or something out of it. Like, I
I
don't
know.
know. So you can't know everything. But I would hope that most history teachers still have that curiosity that kind of led them
Mhm.
into that field, and that they would, I mean, I know it's hard to like use your own spare time for things, but I am always reading up on the things that I teach. I love going to museums. I'm lucky to live in LA where we have a
Mhm.
lot of museums that have artifacts and things from all over the place. So I've kind of learned that way. We have plenty of just like lecturers that come. There's so many kind of like online um, lectures or trainings or whatever from
Mhm.
historians who do have that specific knowledge in that
Mhm.
topic. And so I think that like in order to be a good history teacher, you do kind of have to like keep up with that learning on
Mhm.
your own end. And for me, it's just fun. It doesn't really feel like too much of a sacrifice.
Yeah, and I'm the same way when it comes to whenever I teach a new course for the first time, I do find it as more of a now I have an excuse to do some reading because now I'm doing
Mm-hmm.
it for work now, so now this will
Yeah.
actually apply. I maybe probably struggled, not struggle, maybe struggle is the wrong word, but I was talking to someone about how whenever I'm on vacation, I just think, okay, now this is time to do some reading. It's
Mm-hmm.
not really vacation time,
Not
but
relaxing.
yeah.
Researching.
So yeah, like you're kind of always in the back of your head. I have this weird pressure of, oh, I need to keep like remembering everything so that I can give a better lesson to my students. So you kind of that's just like a history teacher quirk.
Never ending.
Never.
There's always more to learn.
Yeah.
But like, maybe this is my fifth year teaching ancient history. And when I first
Mhm.
started, I really did not know very much. I
Mhm.
am almost certain that when I was in school, no one taught us anything about ancient history.
Yeah,
I
no,
would
nothing.
like bet my life on it. No, we didn't learn
Yep.
anything.
Yep.
And then in college, you can kind of pick your courses. I think we started off with like that long course
Yeah.
too that was kind of, I didn't like it. It was a huge lecture hall. It was just like a lot about Plato's cave, and it was super boring. And then I was just like, I don't want to take any more ancient history. This is so boring. So I didn't know all that much. So in the past like
Yep.
5 years, I've been able to learn so much more. And I feel kind of bad for my 5 years ago students because I didn't
I
have too
know
much extra stuff to pull in. But
the forever guilt of my former students not knowing what I know now. That is
yeah,
now
sorry.
I'm obviously still relatively new, so I'm hoping that I can mitigate that as much as I can. But and
Yeah.
so you just had your first child recently, is that correct?
I have two. I have a
Two. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
seven-year-old and then a 1-year-old. She's almost two.
Okay. And so only reason I ask is what do you think is kind of going to be the teaching of history for this era?
Yeah,
What do you
it's
think that's going to be like?
so interesting to see like my 7-year-old just kind of how he picks things up. because
Hmm.
when he was in kindergarten, he had a really good teacher. It's not like I was ever in the classroom, but I could just
Hmm.
tell by like the questions that he would ask when he would come home. I was like, oh, I can see what, what's going on there. So he knows like some of the books that I've written, and he likes to look at do I have any back here? I don't know. I've written biographies of like famous Americans. And so he'll look at like George Washington or Martin Luther King Jr., whoever. And he would ask me, even when he was 5, he'd be like, did they like slavery or not like slavery? And that was kind of the
Well,
categories that
still,
he
that's a
put in.
pretty like overarching question for a 6-year-old to ask you.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay. So that must have been kind of the framing for some of the people that he was
Mhm.
like learning about. And he, the other day they came home, kind of probably having done a Dr. King lesson since we had
Mhm.
the Monday off for that
Yep.
holiday. And so he came home like telling me all these things about how he died when he was 39 and all these things. So they're learning. Um, but yeah, I definitely like to like supplement. We read a lot of books. So we'll read before
Mhm.
we go to bed, and I'll, kind of pull in these different like history books and culture books and stuff that are meant for
I
kids. Just
You
I
even
want them
get
to
the
have an
history reading into the parenting. I like it. It's a good strategy.
and I
uh,
love taking them to like museums and stuff too.
yeah.
So
It's because yeah, you wrote the book "Thinkers and Leaders in American History." Is that the right
mhm.
title? And so,
Yeah.
what kind of inspired that? What was your selection process like for that? Because I kind of looked at the table of contents there even this morning, and I'll be honest, a few of the names I had never even heard of myself. So
Yeah,
that's maybe even like a gap. So like, what? Yeah.
that was intentional. Well, it was a weird process. The publishing company did this kind of weird thing where like they would just look for like gaps on like Amazon of like what books needed to be written that like maybe people were
Okay.
searching for they
Hmm.
didn't find. And so
Yeah.
they just were like, okay, this is a book that we think would sell. And so they had an outline for it and then asked me to write the book that they had already kind of like conceptualized.
Oh.
So they had a list of 15 people already. And so before I agreed to write it, I was like, well, can I switch up your list a little bit? Like, let's leave some of the big topics in here, but then
Yep.
can we like switch out like every other one and put in some different people? And so they let me do that. And so then I was able to kind of, I asked if I could put Rothschild Francis in, and they were like,
Yeah.
it's a little bit
So
fringe.
how did you, if you don't mind me asking, like, how did you even kind of get involved in the consideration for writing a book like that?
Probably just because I have an online presence. Like, I
Okay.
think they just Googled like history teachers, and probably like my blog or my YouTube videos
Yeah.
came
Okay.
up.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So yeah, that was just kind of happenstance, I guess.
And so of the leaders that you kind of put in yourself or kind of argued for, what was like the main one that you were like, this has to go in no matter what? That was kind of more of an unconventional one.
Yeah, I think Daniel Inouye was one that I
Okay.
really wanted to include. So like I just looked at the list. There's 15. They were mostly men and they were mostly white. So I'm like, let's,
Mhm.
adjust this a little so there's some
Yeah.
more women, some more people of color. And so Daniel Inouye was, I believe, the first Asian American senator. There might have been like one before him, but he was a senator from Hawaii. He has a really, really interesting. This is why things don't get graded. So I'm late on my emails.
I know. Seriously, do not worry about it whatsoever. And I won't keep you for much longer either. We're doing some stuff here at the school in a little bit. Um, but a couple more things, because you do have like a pretty substantial paid teachers kind of present as well. What are like the most commonly purchased things, or like what do you think are the most common needs that you've seen so far?
The thing I think that gets purchased most from my store was something that I made. I want to say like my second year of teaching.
Hmm.
And I think it was the first thing I ever put up, and it's just a Word document. It's just a behavior reflection form, and so it was just something that I made for my. I think I was teaching sixth grade and eighth grade then, and it was just me as a pretty new teacher trying to just like figure out like how do I kind of like allow kids to sort of take a break, but not like banish them, and like I don't
Mm-hmm.
know, how do we reflect on behavior that needs to change. So it was just like, what rule did I break?
Yeah.
What could I do in the future? And I don't know, maybe like what led up to that or something like
Mhm.
that. And so it was just like 3 questions. And so I think I would make copies of them on like a certain color paper, like green or something. And so if a kid was just really
Mhm.
not cooperating, I'm like, okay, I need you to go get a green paper, go sit over. There was a certain desk and just, answer some questions and like take a
Mhm.
break and write those things down. And so that worked in at that time. I haven't really used it lately, but as a new teacher, I needed like something to just like do like, okay, can we like document this? It had the
Yeah.
date on it. And then, if I had a parent meeting or whatever, like, well, here's what your child said, like they understood what they did wrong and they said they were going to fix their behavior. And so it was helpful for me as like a tool as a new teacher.
So what kind of advice would you have for someone like a new teacher right now? Like just
Yeah.
generally speaking, coming in like what
Yeah, it is tough. I think it is very helpful. I know it can be a little bit toxic, but I think it is
Yeah.
helpful to kind of be on social media and like
Mhm.
listen to some podcasts or follow some people on TikTok or Instagram
Mhm.
or whatever and just get a peek into other classrooms and like what other people are doing. That's where I've learned so many things. I'll watch someone do something on like a little Instagram reel or something.
Mhm.
Oh, okay, that's a good idea. Or like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, I could try that. And so many things that I never would have heard of because all day we're in our own classrooms. We hardly even get to see the person teaching next door.
Yeah.
So I think it's just nice to have that little peek into what other people in other states and other countries and
Yeah.
other age levels. Sometimes I'll see people doing things in like elementary classrooms where I'm like, actually, that's very smart. Like,
Yeah.
we don't really do that in secondary, but maybe I could make that work. So just kind of gathering information from other people as much as you can without getting sucked in and like comparing yourself too much.
Yeah. And I
Helpful.
think the my own thing, I think it's not just me. I know a lot of people kind of struggle with the perfectionism thing because you kind of
Yeah.
get into teaching having this image of what it means to be a teacher in your mind. And
Yeah.
then when that's deflated very quickly, you're kind of in a little bit of an identity crisis of who, like, what is this actually? What am I doing here?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I only have one more question for you. It's not really necessarily a question, but I like to kind of finish off all the podcasts with it. It's education is what remains once we forget everything that we learned in school. What
Ooh.
is it that you want your students to kind of take away from their time with you specifically that they wouldn't necessarily get somewhere else?
One of the things that I have kind of always tried to push with my students in anything that I'm teaching is education, exposure, and empathy. So, whatever topic we're learning about, obviously, we want to learn like some facts and figures, the
Mhm.
education, and then exposure to just, maybe this like ancient culture's way of doing things or just this other group of people's way of doing things and just as often as possible get the perspective of those people, like their documents or a YouTube video by somebody who lives there or something like that. So being exposed to new ways of thinking and then empathy and being able to kind of put ourselves in other people's shoes or understand where other people are coming from. And so those three things are kind of always what I want kids to leave my classroom thinking about when they're learning about new things.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much for coming on today. I really appreciate you having you on.
Yeah, thank you. I guess it's snack time for these little ones.